Sometimes the most significant challenge in our spiritual journey is recognizing when a season has ended. We tend to hold on to places, people, and situations because they are familiar, because they offer us a sense of safety. But there comes a moment when God speaks into your life and says, "It's time to leave." And when He does, it is not a suggestion but a divine command wrapped in love. God never tells you to leave without a purpose. When He called Abraham to leave his homeland, He didn't provide a full map or a detailed list of instructions. He simply said, "Go to the land I will show you." It was a test of faith, a call to trust in something greater than Abraham's own understanding. And that's what God is asking you to do today. Maybe you've been holding on to a situation that no longer serves His purpose. Maybe you're staying in a place where God has already moved on from. Think about the disciples when Jesus called them. They left behind their nets, their boats, their jobs. Why? Because when God calls you, you don't stay where you are, you move forward in faith. Imagine if Peter had refused to step out of the boat when Jesus called him. Imagine if Moses had refused to leave Egypt. Imagine if Jesus Himself had refused to leave the comfort of His earthly home to fulfill His mission. When God tells you to leave, it's because He has something greater ahead for you. The problem is that we don't always see it. We hesitate, we second guess, we cling to what is comfortable, even when it's draining our spirit. You ever felt stuck? Have you ever felt like something in your life is no longer growing, no longer bearing fruit? That's often a sign that God is telling you it's time to go. But here's the danger. If you stay when God tells you to leave, you risk missing the blessing He has prepared. Lot's wife looked back and lost everything. Jonah ran in the opposite direction and ended up in the belly of a fish. Some of you have been hearing the voice of God telling you to leave, but fear has held you back. You've been asking for a sign, waiting for more confirmation, but deep down, you already know what God is saying. Friend, you can't step into the new thing God has for you while holding on to the old. You can't walk into your promised land while keeping one foot in Egypt. God is calling you out because there's something greater ahead. The question is, will you trust Him enough to leave? Staying in a place where God has already moved on will drain your spirit and weaken your faith. Some of you feel tired, frustrated, and spiritually empty, not because God has abandoned you, but because you're holding on to a season that has expired. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. God led them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. When the cloud moved, they moved. When it stopped, but what if they had decided to stay behind when the cloud had already moved forward? They would have been left in a dry, barren place without God's presence. Some of you are stuck in situations where the presence of God has already lifted. You're staying in relationships He told you to walk away from. You're holding on to a job He asked you to leave. You're lingering in a place where your faith is dying, your joy is fading, and your spirit is withering. Why? Because comfort is easier than change. But comfort can become a prison when it keeps you from God's best. Look at the prophet Elijah. He was by the brook Cherith, and God provided for him. Ravens brought him food, and he drank from the brook. But one day the brook dried up. God was no longer providing for him there. If Elijah had stayed, he would have died, but God told him to move, to go to Zarephath, where provision was waiting for him. When God stops providing in one place, it's a sign that He has provision waiting for you somewhere else. Jesus himself said, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town." There are places where you will never grow because the people around you only see who you used to be. Some of you are trying to flourish in a land that no longer recognizes your calling. God is saying it's time to leave. Here's the truth. If you don't leave by obedience, you may be forced to leave by circumstances. Jonah refused to go where God was sending him, and he ended up in the belly of a fish. Some of you are wrestling with storms not because of the enemy, but because you're running from where God told you to go. God never removes something without replacing it with something better, but you'll never experience it if you stay where He has already moved on. If your spirit feels dry, if your prayers feel empty, if your passion is gone, ask yourself, am I staying in a place God has already left? If the answer is yes, then friend, it's time to leave. When God calls you to move, He doesn't mean tomorrow, next year, or when it's convenient. He means now. Delaying what God has told you to do is no different from rejecting His command. Some of you have been hearing God's voice, feeling the pull in your spirit, but you keep making excuses. You say, I need more confirmation, I need to be ready, or I'll go when the timing is right. But when God speaks, the time is always right. Look at Abraham. When God told him to leave his homeland, he didn't ask for details. He didn't delay, he went. When Jesus called the disciples, they didn't say, let us think about it. They dropped their nets immediately. Imagine if Noah had waited to build the ark until it started raining. Imagine if Moses had waited until Pharaoh was in a good mood. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Some of you know exactly what God has been telling you to do, but fear, doubt, and excuses have kept you from stepping forward. You're waiting for the perfect conditions, but let me tell you, there will never be a perfect moment. If you're waiting until you feel fully ready, you'll never move. If you're waiting for all the details, you'll stay stuck. God never shows you the whole picture. He only gives you the next step. Think about Lot. The angels told him to leave Sodom immediately because destruction was coming. But the Bible says he lingered. He hesitated and stayed a little longer in a place that was about to be destroyed. Because of his hesitation, he almost lost everything. Some of you are lingering when God is saying, go now. The longer you delay, the more you risk losing. Some of you are waiting for a second confirmation when God has already spoken 5 times. You don't need another sign, you need to obey. God doesn't bless hesitation, He blesses obedience. When Peter saw Jesus walking on water, he could have debated, doubted, or asked for more proof, but instead he stepped out. And because he stepped out, he experienced a miracle. Some of you are standing at the edge of your miracle, but hesitation is holding you back. The longer you delay, the more difficult it becomes to obey. So I ask you today, what has God told you to do that you are still postponing? What door has He told you to walk through that you are still standing outside of? God is calling. The time is now, before it's too late. One of the greatest tragedies in life is missing what God has for you because you refuse to let go of what's behind you. Too many people are stuck in places God told them to leave because they're clinging to the past. They're holding on to memories, regrets, past successes, or even past failures. But let me tell you, you cannot step into the future while holding on to yesterday. Think about Lot's wife. God sent angels to rescue her and her family from the destruction of Sodom. He gave one clear instruction: do not look back. But what did she do? She turned around, and in that moment she lost everything. Why? Because her heart was still in a place that God had already left. Some of you are doing the same thing. God is pulling you forward, but your heart is still tied to the past. You keep looking back at old relationships, old opportunities, old seasons that God has already removed. But listen, the more you look back, the more you risk missing what's ahead. Israel had the same problem. God delivered them from Egypt, but Egypt was still in their hearts. Every time they faced a challenge, they said, "Let's go back. At least we had food in Egypt." Imagine that. They preferred slavery over uncertainty. And because they couldn't let go of the past, an entire generation missed out on the promised land. What are you still holding on to that's keeping you from your promise? Is it a mistake you made years ago? God has already forgiven you, but you refuse to forgive yourself. Is it a season when things were better? You're so focused on what you lost that you can't see what God is preparing. Paul said, "Forgetting what is behind and reaching forward to what is ahead, I press on toward the goal." You can't press on if you're still holding on to the past. Some of you need to stop rehearsing what God has already released you from. You need to stop mourning over doors He has already closed. What's ahead of you is greater than what's behind you, but you'll never see it if you keep looking back. God is calling you forward. He is telling you to leave the past behind. The question is, will you let go so you can step into what He has for you? When God tells you to leave, it's not just a suggestion, it's a divine instruction for your protection, growth, and destiny. But when we ignore His voice and stay where He told us to leave, we open the door to struggles we were never meant to face. Some of you are dealing with stress, frustration, and turmoil, not because it's God's will, but because you refused to move when He told you to. Look at Jonah. God told him to go to Nineveh, but he ran the other way. And what happened? He found himself in the middle of a storm, thrown into the sea, swallowed by a great fish, and trapped in darkness for 3 days. That suffering was not necessary. It was the result of his disobedience. Some of you are wondering why everything feels like a storm, why nothing is working out, why you feel stuck. Could it be that you're running from where God told you to go? Think about the Israelites. God delivered them from Egypt and told them to enter the promised land, but instead of trusting Him, they doubted, complained, and refused to move forward. As a result, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. An entire generation missed their promise simply because they wouldn't obey. Some of you are wandering right now, going in circles, struggling with the same issues year after year. It's not because God has forgotten you. It's because you refused to move when He told you to. Even in the New Testament, we see this truth when Jesus told the disciples to leave everything and follow Him. Imagine if they had said no. Imagine if Peter had said, "I'll follow you later, but right now I need to stay with my fishing business." He would have never walked on water. He would have never witnessed the miracles. He would have never fulfilled his destiny. Delayed obedience is still disobedience, and disobedience always carries consequence. Some of you are in situations where God's grace has already lifted, but you refuse to move. You're staying in jobs that bring no peace. You're holding on to relationships that are breaking you. You're clinging to situations that God has already told you to walk away from, and as a result, you're struggling unnecessarily. God's instructions are never meant to harm you. They're meant to bless you. If He's telling you to leave, it's because He has something better ahead. Don't let fear, doubt, or stubbornness keep you in a place God never intended for you to remain. If you refuse to move when He speaks, you might find yourself in a storm that could have been avoided. Listen to His voice and move when He tells you to, because obedience will lead you into His blessings, but disobedience will only bring unnecessary hardship. Many people hesitate to leave because they fear losing what they already have. They think, if I walk away, what if I never get anything better? What if this is the best it will ever be? But let me tell you something. When God asks you to leave, He never takes something away without intending to give you something better. Look at the disciples. They left behind their fishing nets, their families, their businesses, everything they knew to follow Jesus. At first it might have seemed like they were losing, but in reality, they were stepping into a life far greater than they could ever have imagined. They saw miracles, walked with the Son of God, and changed the world. Think about Ruth. She had every reason to stay in Moab after her husband died. She could have clung to what was familiar, but instead, she left her past behind and followed Naomi into the unknown. She didn't know that God had a Boaz waiting for her. She didn't know she would become part of the lineage of King David and ultimately the Messiah. What looked like loss was actually a divine setup for something greater. Some of you are afraid to leave because you don't know what's ahead, but let me remind you, God never asks you to let go without preparing something better. If you release what's in your hands, He will fill them with something greater than you ever imagined. Remember when Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. Sometimes God has to allow things in your life to die so that new things can grow. If you hold on to dead relationships, dead opportunities, or dead seasons, you'll never experience the harvest He has for you. Look at Job. He lost everything, his wealth, his children, his health, but because he remained faithful, God restored him and gave him twice as much as he had before. The enemy thought Job's story was over, but God had a better ending in mind, and He has a better ending for you too, if you are willing to let go. What are you holding on to that God is asking you to release? Is it a job, a relationship, a plan you created for yourself? Let me tell you, if God is telling you to leave, it's not because He wants to harm you. It's because He wants to bless you. Leaving with God is never losing. It's stepping into something greater than you could ever imagine. Will you trust Him enough to let go? One of the biggest fears people face when God tells them to leave is the fear of loneliness. They think, if I walk away, who will be with me? If I leave this place, this relationship, this situation, will I have to walk alone? But hear me today. When God calls you to leave, He never sends you out alone. He goes before you, walks beside you, and stands behind you. Look at Abraham. When God told him to leave his homeland, he had to step away from his family, his culture, everything he knew. It must have been terrifying, but God said, I will bless you, I will make your name great, I will be with you. Abraham didn't walk alone, God walked with him. Moses struggled with the same fear when God called him to leave the wilderness and go to Pharaoh. He said, who am I to do this? But God didn't tell Moses how strong he was or how capable he was. He simply said, I will be with you. That was all Moses needed. Some of you are afraid of leaving because you think, I'll have no one, I'll be isolated, I'll be abandoned. But listen, even if people walk away, even if you leave everything behind, You will never be alone. God Himself will go with you. Jesus made this promise in Matthew 28:20. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He didn't say, I will be with you sometimes. He didn't say, I will be with you when things are easy. He said, I am with you always. Paul understood this. There was a time when everyone abandoned him. He was in prison, falsely accused and alone. He wrote, at my first offense, no one stood with me, but the Lord stood by my side and gave me strength. Maybe you feel like that today. Maybe you feel abandoned. Maybe you feel like you're stepping into the unknown without support. But listen to me. You are not alone. God is standing beside you. Some of the greatest moments of your life will come not when you're surrounded by people, but when you're alone with God. Jacob had to leave everything before he had his encounter with God. Elijah had to go into the wilderness before he heard God's still small voice. John the Baptist lived in the desert before he prepared the way for the Lord. Even Jesus had to go into the wilderness before stepping into his full ministry. Maybe God is telling you to leave a place where you've depended on people so you can learn to depend on Him. Maybe He's calling you out of a familiar crowd so you can hear His voice more clearly. Yes, leaving can feel lonely, but you are never truly alone. God Himself is walking with you, and if He is with you, you have everything you need. So step forward with confidence, knowing that the one who called you is also the one who goes before you. When God calls you to leave, it's never just about a physical change. It's about faith. God doesn't ask us to leave something behind just for the sake of leaving. He does it to grow our trust in Him, to deepen our dependence on Him, and to position us for greater blessings. Hebrews 11:6 tells us, without faith it is impossible to please God. And what is faith? Faith is trusting God even when you don't have all the answers. Faith is moving forward even when you can't see the destination. Faith is saying, Lord, I don't know what's next, but I trust you. Look at Noah. God told him to leave behind his normal life and build an ark before there was even a sign of rain. People mocked him. They thought he was crazy. But Noah didn't need to see the storm. He simply trusted what God said, and because of his faith, he and his family were saved while the rest of the world perished. Abraham left his home without knowing where he was going, but because of his faith, God blessed him with land, a legacy, and a covenant that would change history. His faith led to his reward. Peter left his fishing boat to follow Jesus. What if he had stayed? He would have spent his life catching fish instead of becoming a fisher of men. But because he stepped out in faith, he became one of the greatest apostles the world has ever known. Some of you are standing at the edge of a decision, and fear is telling you, what if it doesn't work out? What if you fail? What if you lose everything? But let me ask you, what if you don't move? What blessings will you miss? What doors will remain closed? What miracles will never happen because you refused to take a step of faith? In Matthew 19:29, Jesus made a promise. Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. God is not a taker. He is a rewarder. When He calls you to leave, He always has something greater in store. Maybe you can't see it yet. Maybe it doesn't make sense. But faith is not about seeing. It's about trusting. Faith is believing that if God tells you to leave, He will provide, He will protect, and He will reward. The question today is not, is it safe? The question is God calling? Because if He is calling, stepping out in faith is the safest thing you can do. And when you move in faith, you will always walk into God's reward. My friend, I don't know what God is calling you to leave today. Maybe it's a place, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a mindset, a habit, or a season that has lasted longer than it should. But I do know this. When God tells you to leave, it's never to harm you. It's always to lead you into something greater. You may be afraid. You may not see the full picture. But God is saying, trust me. He is calling you to step out, to let go, to move forward. Not because He wants to take something away, but because He wants to bless you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Don't be like Lot's wife, stuck in the past when God is calling you to the future. Don't be like the Israelites, wandering in circles because of fear and disobedience. Be like Abraham, who left everything behind and walked into the promises of God. Be like Peter, who stepped out of the boat and into his calling. Be like Ruth, who left her past behind and became part of God's divine plan. Yes, leaving can be hard. It can feel uncertain. But hear me. You are not leaving alone. God is walking with you, and if God is with you, you will not fail. If God is calling you, He has already prepared the way. If God is leading you, He has something better waiting ahead. So today, I challenge you, stop hesitating, stop doubting, stop looking back. If God is telling you to leave, step out in faith, walk forward with confidence, and watch as God opens doors, provides miracles, and leads you into a future far greater than anything you could ever plan for yourself. The blessing is ahead of you, not behind you. So don't wait. Move when God calls and step into the promise He has prepared for you.